Welcome to Sci-Fi Traveler Friends. I'm back with another fantastic adventure. In this episode, we'll hear the story of Daniel and Stella. Fasten your seatbelts. Sci-Fi Traveler is about to begin. The coffee had gone cold 40 minutes ago, and Daniel had done absolutely nothing about it. This was, in the grand scheme of things, a minor personal failing. He was aware of that. The mug sat at the edge of his console like a quiet accusation. Steam long since surrendered to the recycled air of the Meridian's lower deck, and every few minutes he would glance at it with the full intention of doing something, reheating it, drinking it cold, pouring it out, and then simply not. There was a word for this kind of behavior, several words probably. His sister had used most of them on him at various points. He pulled up the transit log instead and scrolled through it without reading it. The Meridian was 14 hours out from Callaway Station, carrying a hold full of compressed coolant canisters and, somewhat inexplicably, 3 crates of artisanal soap from a manufacturer on Kepler Colony 4 who had apparently decided that frontier settlements were an untapped market for lavender-scented luxury. Daniel had signed the manifest personally. He still wasn't sure how he felt about it. "You going to finish that hand or not?" said Yusuf from across the folding table, not looking up from his cards. He had the particular expression of a man holding something good and trying very hard to look like he wasn't. "I'm thinking," Daniel said. "You've been thinking for 11 minutes. I timed it. Thinking takes as long as it takes. That is either very profound or very annoying, and I haven't decided which." Daniel laid down a card. Yusuf's expression didn't change, which meant Daniel had made a mistake. He reached for his cold coffee and finally, defiantly, drank some of it. It tasted like regret and mild depression, which was roughly what he'd expected. The Meridian was not a glamorous ship. It was the kind of vessel that got the job done in the way a sensible pair of boots gets the job done, without elegance, without complaint, and with a specific squeak in the third corridor that maintenance had been meaning to look at for 8 months. Daniel had served on her for 3 years, which in freight rotation terms made him practically a local landmark. He knew which bunk springs were shot, which console panel had a lag on the left touchpad, and exactly how many ceiling tiles in the engine room had been replaced since the coolant incident of last autumn that no one was officially allowed to discuss. It was, in its own unglamorous way, home. "Your deal," Yusuf said, raking the cards toward himself, with the satisfaction of a man who had won something he'd never doubted he would win. Daniel gathered the deck and shuffled it with the mechanical competence of someone who had spent too many long hauls doing exactly this. Outside the porthole to his left, small, scratched at the edges, perpetually underestimated as a view, the stars held perfectly still, the way they always did, indifferent and enormous, and not especially interested in the Meridian or her cargo of coolant and artisanal soap. The hull breach alarm did not sound. That was the first strange thing about what happened next. There was no warning, no pressure change alert, no cascade failure signal, no automated voice delivering the particular brand of calm, procedural dread that shipboard emergency systems specialized in. There was simply, between one breath and the next, a sound like the universe deciding to skip a beat. A grinding concussive shudder that moved through the floor and up through Daniel's boots and into his back teeth. And then the wall to his left was simply gone, and the cold came in all at once. He had time to drop the cards. He did not have time to do anything else. The void took him the way the void always took things, completely and without particular interest in his opinion on the matter. The Meridian's interior light shrank to a rectangle, and then a line, and then nothing. The cold was not the cold of winter or of deep water. It was the cold of the complete absence of warmth, which is a different thing entirely, and it settled into him with a kind of appalling thoroughness. He was aware, distantly and almost academically, that he was moving, that the ship was behind him, that the stars were, as always, very far away. He thought about the card game. He thought, specifically and absurdly, that he had probably been about to lose it anyway. Then he thought about his sister, and whether she had gotten the message he'd sent from Callaway, and whether she would water the plant he kept at her apartment while he was on rotation, a small succulent he had owned for 6 years and named Gerald, though he'd never admitted this to anyone. He thought about Gerald with a strange and sudden tenderness. Then the cold finished what it had started, and the thought stopped, and there was nothing. not darkness exactly, because darkness still implies a somewhere, but the particular quality of absence that exists between two stars where no one has any particular reason to be. He made his peace with the silence. It seemed, under the circumstances, the reasonable thing to do. He closed his eyes. He was relatively certain he would not be opening them again. Warmth was the first betrayal. Not light, not sound. Warmth. It arrived before anything else did, slipping in underneath the cold like a rumor, tentative at first and then with increasing confidence, the way sunlight moves across a floor in the early morning when it thinks no one is watching. Daniel noticed it the way you notice something that has no right to exist, with a kind of slow, reluctant suspicion, like finding your keys in the place you actually left them. He did not open his eyes immediately. This was not courage. This was the deeply human instinct that if you don't look at something, it might still turn out to be a dream, and dreams are considerably easier to deal with than the alternatives. He lay still and took a quiet inventory of himself instead. Fingers. Present, responding, toes, accounted for. The specific ache behind his left shoulder that had been with him since a loading incident 3 years ago on Vega Station, inexplicably, almost insultingly, still there. Some things, it turned out, survived the void on pure stubbornness. He was breathing. This was the part that really gave him trouble. He opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was the color of pale quartz, curved and high and faintly luminous in the way of things that generate their own light, rather than borrow it from somewhere else. It was not a ceiling he recognized. It was not, if he was being precise about it, a ceiling that belonged to any ship or station he had ever set foot on, and he had set foot on a considerable number of ships and stations over the course of a 12-year career in deep space freight. This ceiling had the quality of something grown rather than built. Its surface moved, not dramatically, not with any urgency, but with the slow rhythmic patience of a lung. In and out, as if the room itself was keeping time with some interior breath. Daniel stared at it for a long moment. "Right," he said, to no one in particular. His voice came out roughly, the texture of gravel and mild bewilderment, and it disappeared into the chamber without an echo, absorbed by walls that seemed, like the ceiling, to be faintly alive. He turned his head slowly. The room, chamber, really, it had the proportions of something ceremonial, was formed entirely of pale crystal structures, irregular and organic, rising from the floor and arching overhead like the ribs of some vast and very well-lit creature. The light had no single source. It lived in the walls. It drifted. Watching it was a little like watching bioluminescence in deep water, which was itself a little like watching something dream. Scattered through the space were objects he couldn't name, instruments possibly, or art. In his experience, the line between the two got thinner the further out into space you traveled. Then he became aware of a presence at the edge of his vision and turned his head further and found her. She was kneeling beside him, close, but not crowding, with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting patiently for a specific thing and has now seen it begin to happen. Her skin was the blue of deep ocean water just before it tips into black, the kind of blue that implies enormous depth and keeps its secrets about what lives in it. Her hair was dark and fell simply, without ceremony. Her face was, and Daniel's brain supplied the word before he had a chance to interrogate it, kind. Composed in a way that wasn't coldness, attentive in a way that wasn't clinical. Her ears, he noticed after a moment, came to soft, elegant points beneath the fall of her hair. She was looking at him the way you look at something you have been quietly worried about for some time and have now been quietly relieved about, though the relief is too private a thing to make much noise. She was smiling. Not with excitement, not with the performative warmth of someone trying to appear less alarming to a confused stranger, which, Daniel felt, would have been entirely justified given the circumstances. It was something slower than that. Something that had already been there before he woke up and didn't need his waking up to justify its existence. He opened his mouth. "Where?" he started. She shook her head. Not a sharp movement. A gentle one. the way you'd stop someone from getting up too fast after a fall. Her expression said, with remarkable clarity for an expression belonging to someone who had yet to say a single word, "That question will keep. You will be all right. Stay where you are for a moment." Daniel closed his mouth. He considered this. Then he looked back up at the ceiling that breathed and processed the sum total of his current situation, which was as follows. He had been pulled into hard vacuum through a hull breach on the Meridian, had experienced what he was fairly confident qualified as the beginning of death, and had woken up on an alien vessel being watched over by a blue-skinned woman with pointed ears who was smiling at him like he was something worth smiling at. He was alive. He was, by any sane metric, not supposed to be alive. His left shoulder still hurt, which was either deeply reassuring or an extraordinary level of commitment to continuity on the universe's part. "Okay," he said quietly to the ceiling. Then, because it felt like the situation warranted some acknowledgement of the magnitude of what had apparently just happened, "Okay." The woman beside him said something then, a soft arrangement of sounds, liquid and layered, like two streams of meaning running parallel to each other. He didn't understand a syllable of it, but her tone had the cadence of something steady and unhurried, and it landed in him the way a hand on the shoulder lands, not answering anything, not explaining anything, just confirming that there was someone present who intended to remain so. He turned his head to look at her again. She raised an eyebrow. That, at least, was a gesture that crossed whatever distance existed between their respective species, and the smile shifted slightly, became something warmer at the corners. Daniel decided, with the particular irrationality of a man who has just survived the impossible, that this was fine, that he was fine, that the breathing ceiling and the crystal ribs and the inexplicable warmth and the kind-faced stranger kneeling beside him were all, in some cosmically improbable way, fine. He also decided he was absolutely going to need coffee. The universal translator, as it turned out, was not universal. This was the kind of information Daniel felt someone should have put in the brochure. If there had been a brochure, which there hadn't, because no one had ever anticipated that he would need one. The device Stella had produced from somewhere in the folds of her garment was small and disc-shaped and hummed at a frequency that sat just below conscious hearing, the way certain headaches do. She had held it out to him with the careful deliberateness of someone offering something valuable to someone who might drop it, and he had taken it with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that it was valuable and was trying very hard not to drop it. He had learned her name from it. That much worked. Stella. She had touched her own collarbone when she said it, the gesture so instinctively human that it had momentarily short-circuited his ability to process anything else. He had done the same. Daniel. She had repeated it back to him with a slight softening of the second syllable that made it sound like something quieter and more considered than he'd ever heard it sound before, and he had found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't mind. The rest of the translation was where things got complicated. The device handled nouns with reasonable confidence. Object words, direction words, the basic architecture of practical communication. These moved between them with something approaching reliability. What it struggled with, profoundly and sometimes comically, was everything else. Abstractions, tenses, the entire category of meaning that lived between words rather than in them. At one point, Stella had said something that the translator rendered, after a pause that suggested genuine uncertainty, as, "The air here is correct for your inside." Daniel had thought about this for a moment. "Do you mean the oxygen levels are calibrated for humans?" She had looked at the translator. The translator had apparently done its best. She had then looked back at Daniel with an expression of mild frustration that was so recognizable it had made him laugh. Actually laugh, unexpected and genuine. And she had tilted her head at the sound of it, as if filing it away. "It means your lungs won't complain," he offered. She said something. The translator said, "Good. The lungs are important." "They really are," Daniel agreed. "I've grown quite attached to mine." She didn't get that one. But she seemed to understand that it had been an attempt at something, and she gave him a look that was patient and slightly amused, and very much the look of someone who had decided, on limited evidence, to extend a reasonable amount of good faith to a strange creature she'd fished out of the dark. He was sitting up now, which was progress. His back was against one of the crystal formations, warm to the touch, which he still found disquieting, because crystal had no business being warm, and yet here they were. And Stella sat across from him cross-legged on the floor, which itself had the faint give of something organic, like packed moss or the deck of a ship made from material that had once been alive and retained the memory of it. Between them, she had placed a container of something that steamed gently, which she had indicated he should drink, and which he was approaching with the careful optimism of a man who has decided that being poisoned would at least be a familiar kind of problem. He drank some. It tasted like warm minerals and something faintly sweet underneath, like the idea of fruit rather than fruit itself. It was not coffee. It was not trying to be coffee. He found that, under the circumstances, he respected it for that. "How long?" he asked, and held up his fingers, then pointed at himself, then pointed vaguely outward to indicate the void, which was a hopelessly imprecise gesture, but the translator didn't seem to do much better with how long as a concept. Stella considered this. She extended 3 fingers, then made a slow arc with her hand that he took to mean something about time passing, or perhaps orbits. 3 of something. 3 hours seemed survivable. 3 days was harder. 3 of whatever unit her civilization used to measure duration, that was a question for later. 3 hours? He tried. The translator gave her something. She tilted her head and offered what might have been a confirmation, or might have been a polite agreement to disagree, and Daniel decided to log it as 3 hours and move forward, because forward was the only direction that was doing him any good. He looked around the chamber again. In the time since he'd woken up, he had cataloged what he could from his limited vantage point. The crystal formations appeared to serve some function beyond architecture. Occasionally they pulsed, deep and slow, in response to sounds or movements, like an audience quietly responding to something said. There were no visible seams in the walls, no sharp angles anywhere. The whole vessel, he was fairly certain now it was a small vessel rather than a station, had the design language of something that had never once considered a straight line a virtue. It curved everywhere, flowed, doubled back on itself in ways that suggested whoever built it had a very different relationship with interior space than any human engineer he'd ever met. "Your ship," he said, and mimed something with his hands that was meant to convey the idea of a ship and was probably more suggestive of a very small bird. "Just you?" Stella looked at the translator, then at him, then back at the translator. The translator delivered something. She nodded once, clearly, unambiguously, and said something brief that the device rendered as, "Alone. Yes. Survey mission. You were not expected." "No," Daniel agreed. "I wasn't expecting me either." She looked at him then, really looked, with an attention that was neither invasive nor comfortable to be on the receiving end of, but was the kind of look that people give things they are genuinely trying to understand. Her eyes were dark, flecked with something that caught the ambient light of the walls. There was a question somewhere in that look that the translator hadn't been asked to carry yet. He met it as honestly as he could. "Thank you," he said, simply, without embellishment, because embellishment felt wrong here, felt like it would muddy something that was better kept clean. "For pulling me out." The translator worked. She was quiet for a moment after receiving it. Then she said something soft and brief, and the device, for once, gave him something almost complete. It said, "You were not difficult to find. You were very still out there. I thought at first you were something else." "What did you think I was?" Daniel asked. She met his eyes. Something moved across her expression. Not quite sorrow, not quite its opposite. Her ears, delicate and pointed, shifted almost imperceptibly, the way an animal's do when it hears something from far away. The translator rendered her answer as, "I thought you were a piece of the ship. Then I saw you had a face." Daniel sat with that for a long moment. "Well," he said finally, "I'm glad the face was the deciding factor." Time moved differently on Stella's ship. Daniel couldn't prove this scientifically. He didn't have the instruments, and the translator was not equipped for the philosophy of temporal perception, as he had discovered when he'd tried to explain the concept and received back something the device rendered as, "You are asking if the clock is lying," which honestly wasn't the worst way to put it. But the feeling persisted regardless. Hours here had a different texture. They didn't rush. They didn't drag. They simply arrived and then stayed a while, the way good weather does, unhurried and without particular agenda. He had been given a space to sleep, a shallow alcove off the main chamber, lined with something that was not quite fabric and not quite foam but performed the function of both with quiet competence, and he had slept in it for what his body insisted was a long time, and what his mind refused to quantify. When he woke, the walls were breathing in a slightly different rhythm, which he had begun to interpret, without any real evidence, as the ship's equivalent of morning. Stella was already awake. He wasn't sure she had slept at all. She was at a curved console near the forward section of the vessel, and forward was a relative term, since the ship's interior resisted the usual cardinal logic of human spacecraft, preferring instead a kind of spatial grammar that prioritized flow over function, her hands moving across a surface that responded to her touch with quiet pulses of light. She was doing something that looked important. She was also, Daniel noticed as he emerged from the alcove with the approximate grace of a man who had just slept on alien moss foam and wasn't sure how his spine felt about it, humming, softly, under her breath. A sound with no melody he could name, but with a shape to it, a kind of gentle internal rhythm, like someone thinking in music. She stopped when she heard him, turned. He raised a hand. She did the same, not a copy of the gesture, but something analogous, a returning of the acknowledgement. And then she reached for the translator disc on the console beside her and held it up between them like a reminder that conversation was technically possible, with appropriate expectations. "Good morning?" Daniel tried. "If it's morning, is it morning?" The translator worked. Stella looked at it, then at him, then at the console, then back at him. She said something that came back as, "The ship does not keep morning, but you slept. So it is morning for you." That's either very accommodating or very relativistic. She tilted her head. The translator, apparently, had given her something in the vicinity of the joke, but not quite the joke itself, because her expression was the expression of someone standing just outside a room where something funny has happened. Hearing the laughter, but not the cause. He was starting to recognize that expression. It had become, in an odd way, one of his favorite things to see, because it was always followed by the moment she decided to move forward anyway, into the humor on trust. She said something. The translator said, "Explain the joke." He blinked. "I don't think jokes survive explanation," he said. "That's sort of their whole vulnerability." The translator gave her that. She considered it for a moment, then produced a sound that was lower and briefer than the laugh he'd heard from her once before, but was clearly in the same family, a cousin of amusement arriving without ceremony. He counted it as a win. She gestured for him to follow her. The part of the ship she led him through next was not the main chamber. It was smaller, rounder, and the crystal formations here were denser and more intricate, growing into latticed structures that served as shelving, as storage, as what appeared to be a navigation array. A slow, rotating display of points and lines that hung in the air above a central plinth, without any visible projection source, simply existing there, a three-dimensional map of the surrounding space rendered in pale blue light. Daniel stopped in front of it without meaning to. Stars. He recognized the patterns, or almost recognized them. The geometry was familiar, but the orientation was wrong, in the specific way that told him he was looking at a region of space he knew, from an angle he'd never had before. "Where are we?" he asked, and pointed at the map. Stella moved to the plinth and touched it, and the display shifted, expanded outward to show a larger region, then contracted to a specific cluster of coordinates, one point glowing marginally brighter than the others. She touched that point. Then she touched her own chest, then the glowing point again. "Here," Daniel said. "We're here." She nodded. Then she moved her finger a short distance across the display to another cluster and looked at him with a question in it. "Callaway Station," he said. He almost said home, then didn't, for reasons he didn't fully examine. "That's where I was headed." The translator carried it. She looked at the display for a moment, measuring something. Distance or time or both, or some unit of navigation that his species hadn't named yet. And then she said something that came back as, not far. 3 days, perhaps 4. I can take you to the edge of their signal range. He looked at the map. 3 or 4 days. He nodded, and meant it as gratitude, and thought she probably understood that. Then she did something he hadn't expected. She reached past him to the navigation display and expanded it further outward, much further, until the region where they stood was a small bright footnote in a vast dark cartography. And she pointed to a distant cluster, far off the edges of any map he'd ever worked with, and her expression changed. Became something harder to read, something private that she had decided, for reasons of her own, to share. He studied the cluster. Small. Unremarkable, at this scale. Home? He asked. She looked at him. The translator hadn't been invoked, but she seemed to understand the word anyway, or understand the shape of the asking. And she gave a small, quiet nod that carried more weight than its size suggested. Far, Daniel said. She didn't need the translator for that either. She simply agreed, in the way people agree with things that are true and not especially comfortable to confirm. They stood for a moment together in front of the vast pale map, 2 small figures in the blue light of a galaxy that was mostly distance and mostly dark, and almost entirely indifferent to either of them being in it. Daniel's shoulder ached. Outside the living walls of the ship, between them and Calloway and her distant, unremarkable home, the stars held still. You were out here alone, he said. Surveying. The translator worked, she said. Yes. Surveying is quiet work, I prefer quiet. And then I showed up. She looked at him. The smile came back, the original one, the one he'd woken up to, the one that seemed to predate any particular reason for smiling. The translator offered her answer. And then you showed up. You were very quiet too at first. I thought perhaps it would be fine. Daniel laughed. She watched him laugh, that same filing away attention. And this time, the cousin of amusement arrived faster, less cautious, as if it was beginning to learn the route. The second day was when things got complicated. Not between them, or not only between them. The complication was more internal than that, the kind that doesn't announce itself but simply accumulates, the way pressure does in a sealed system, until you notice the gauge has been climbing for a while and you weren't watching. Daniel noticed it in the late middle of what his body had decided to call afternoon, when the walls were doing their slow breathing thing, and Stella was somewhere in the aft section of the ship doing something technical that involved a sound like very quiet bells, and he was sitting alone in the main chamber with the translator disc and his own thoughts for company. His thoughts were not, it turned out, especially good company. The meridian, Yusuf, the cards on the table, the way the wall had simply stopped existing. He had not let himself think about it directly until now. There was a skill developed over years of long hauls and close calls and the particular psychological arithmetic of deep space freight, of keeping difficult things at arm's length until you had the structural stability to look at them properly. He had been using that skill since he woke up on this ship, filling the distance with the work of communication, with the immediate logistics of being alive when he hadn't expected to be. But the distance had a limit, and he had apparently reached it. He sat with it for a while. The cold, the speed of it, the playing cards. Then he thought about Yusuf, specifically, whether he'd made it to a suit in time, whether the emergency bulkheads had sealed fast enough, whether anyone had. And that was the thought that had teeth. So he set it down carefully, the way you set down something hot, and breathed through the wall's rhythm until his own breathing matched it, which was either therapeutic or deeply strange and possibly both. He heard the bells stop. A moment later, Stella appeared in the archway of the main chamber, took one look at him, and did not say anything. She simply came and sat down across from him in her cross-legged way, and placed the translator between them and waited, with the patience of someone who understood that certain silences were not problems to be solved. He looked at her. How do you do that? He asked. The translator worked. She looked back at him with a question. Know when something is wrong, he clarified. You walked in and you just knew. She considered this for a moment before answering. The translator gave him I have been watching your face since you woke up. I am still learning what it means. But some things on a face do not need translation. Daniel absorbed this. What does my face say right now? She looked at him steadily. Her answer came back as, it says you are thinking about something that happened before I found you, and that the thinking is not going well. He laughed, short and without much humor in it. Accurate. She waited. He understood from 2 days of learning the grammar of her patience that the waiting was not indifference. It was a held open door. My ship, he said. The breach. I don't know if the others made it. The translator worked. Something moved across her face. Not pity, he was glad to note, because pity would have felt like the wrong shape for this room. It was something more careful than pity, more respectful of the weight. She said, I did not find others. I found only you. But I was not searching. I was passing. It is possible I missed things. Yeah, he said. It's possible. It was also possible the answer was worse than that, and they both understood that. And she didn't dress it up, and he was grateful. They sat for a while longer. The walls breathed. At some point she reached across and moved the translator disc slightly to one side, which he had come to understand was a gesture meaning something approximate to, we don't need that right now. He nodded, and they sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable and not comfortable exactly, but was honest, which he thought was probably the most you could ask of a silence shared between two people from different star systems who had known each other for less than 3 days. Then she said something without the translator. He didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of someone offering a piece of their own weight in exchange for company in carrying yours, and it required no translation at all. He looked at her. Tell me, he said, and reached for the disc and set it between them again. She was quiet for a moment longer. Then she began. It came through the translator in fragments, which was always how the important things came. Not because the device failed, but because she seemed to choose the fragments deliberately, as if meaning were a thing to be approached from the sides rather than head-on. She had been a surveyor for a long time, longer than this mission, longer than the one before it. She had come to prefer the outer edges of mapped space because out here the data was still new and the questions still open, and the silence was not empty, but full of things that hadn't been named yet. She had not always preferred the silence was the thing. There was a before. She did not name the before directly. She named it sideways, in the way of people who have found that naming a thing directly gives it more oxygen than you can afford. But the shape of it emerged anyway. Someone she had known, someone who had also gone into space and not come back from it in the way that matters. Not through a hull breach. Her people's ships were different. Their technologies ran along different principles. There were other ways that space collected its toll, but the shape of the loss was the same shape. It was the same going silent that Daniel recognized from the thought he'd had to set down carefully. She had been passing through this region for 2 years now, she said. The translator stumbled slightly over whatever unit of time she meant, but 2 of something, watching, cataloging, sending data home to people who were glad of the data and did not ask too often about the person sending it. Daniel listened. He listened the way he had not listened to anything in a long time, with all of himself, without preparing his response or managing his expression or doing any of the things people do when they are waiting for their turn to speak, rather than actually hearing what is being said. When she finished, he didn't say he was sorry, because he had the sense she had heard that before and that it had not helped. He said, "The silence you were talking about, the full kind. Is that why you stopped for me?" She looked at the translator, then she looked at him. Her answer came back as, "I stopped because you were there. But perhaps I was already going slowly." Something in that landed with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to its size. He turned it over carefully. "I'm glad you were going slowly," he said. She picked up the translator disc and turned it once in her hand, a gesture he had not seen before, private and habitual. The way people handle objects when a feeling is too large and their hands need something to do. Her ears shifted slightly, that small animal attentiveness. Outside the ship, between them and everything else, the stars did what stars have always done, burned at tremendous distances, indifferent and permanent, and secretly very interested, if stars are capable of interest, in what happens in the small warm spaces between them. "What was their name?" Daniel asked quietly. "If you want to tell me." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said a name, her language, no translation requested. And it sounded like two notes of music placed carefully next to each other, and she said it the way you say something you have not said aloud in a long time and have been afraid to find that it still hurts. It still hurt. He could see that plainly. "Thank you for telling me," he said. She nodded once. Small and real, the walls breathed on. Neither of them moved for a while, and the silence between them had changed. Not lighter, not heavier, but different in the way of silences that have been used for something and now carry the memory of it. The rescue signal came on the third day, which was either very good timing or very bad timing, depending on which part of Daniel he consulted. The practical part, the part that knew about oxygen reserves and nutrition and the psychological literature on isolation in deep space, said very good. The other part, which had no official name, but had been getting louder since approximately the middle of day 2, said something more complicated and didn't put it into words. Stella had picked up the signal first. Her instruments were better than anything he'd ever worked with, sensitive in ways that suggested her civilization had been paying closer attention to the physics of communication for considerably longer than his had. She had come to find him in the alcove, where he'd been sitting with the translator and a container of the mineral sweet drink he'd stopped noticing the strangeness of sometime yesterday. And she had held up the disc between them and said, "There is a signal, human pattern. Looking for you, I think." He had taken the disc from her and held it and not immediately said anything. "How far?" he asked after a moment. She had shown him on the navigation display, the same pale blue cartography where he had found her distant, unremarkable home star 3 days ago. A vessel moving on an intercept course. Callaway Station Registry, if he was reading the signal geometry correctly, which he was, because 12 years of deep space freight does things to your ability to read signal geometry whether you want it to or not. 8 hours, give or take. He had nodded. She had watched him nod. Neither of them had said anything else for a little while, which was something they had both gotten very good at. The 8 hours passed the way the previous days had passed, in the unhurried way of Stella's ship, which still kept no morning and held no opinion on the matter, but with a quality underneath them now that hadn't been there before. Not tension exactly. Not grief exactly. Something that didn't have a clean name in either of their languages, which the translator could hardly be blamed for failing to produce. They spent part of it at the navigation display, where Stella showed him things she was mapping. Formations in the outer belt, mineral signatures in the dark between systems, a phenomenon she had been tracking for months that the translator could only render as a place where light behaves with uncertainty, which she seemed to find professionally fascinating and personally beautiful, and which he decided was probably some form of quantum gravitational anomaly, though he kept that diagnosis to himself because it felt like explaining a painting in terms of its paint. He asked questions, and she answered them, and the answers were frequently larger than the questions, which was something he had come to expect from her and had grown to love. And there it was, that word, arriving without ceremony, in the middle of a thought about astrophysics, and he let it sit there and looked at it honestly and did not pretend it was something smaller. They spent another part of the 8 hours doing something that had become, without either of them deciding it, a kind of ritual. She would say something in her own language, not for translation, just to say it, and he would listen to the shape of it. Then he would say something in his, and she would do the same. Not communicating exactly. Something adjacent to communication. The thing that exists underneath language, that language is always trying to catch up with. At one point he said, "Gerald." She looked at him. "My succulent," he said. "The plant I told you about. I've been thinking about him." He paused. "I think he's probably fine. He's very low maintenance. I respect that about him." She said something that the translator gave him as, "You named a plant." "I name lots of things," Daniel said with dignity. "It's a legitimate coping mechanism. She made the sound, not the cousin of amusement anymore, but the full thing, the one he'd first heard days ago and had been, if he was being honest with himself, quietly engineering opportunities to hear again. It lasted longer this time. When it subsided, she looked at him with an expression that was warm and specific and belonged, he understood, only to this conversation, and these days and the particular accident of him being where he was when the hull gave way. An hour before the rescue vessel came into range, she took him to a part of the ship he hadn't seen. Small, almost perfectly round, with a single curved wall that was less crystalline than the rest. Smoother, darker, more transparent. A viewport. Not a scratched and underestimated porthole like the Meridians, but a proper wide arc of something that looked like glass and probably wasn't, looking out into the full, unobstructed dark. He stood at it for a long time. She stood beside him. The stars were the same stars. They were always the same stars. But something about looking at them from here, beside her, after everything, made them look slightly different. Not smaller, not larger, but more accurately sized somehow. Like seeing something in proper proportion for the first time. I used to look out at them and just see distance, he said. He wasn't sure when he'd decided to say it. Like a problem to be crossed, you know. Point A to point B, cargo manifest, docking fees, cold coffee. He paused. I think I was looking at it wrong. The translator worked. She was quiet for a moment. Her answer came back as, I have looked at them for a long time. Some days they are distance. Some days they are something else. The difference is not in them. No, he agreed. It isn't. The rescue vessel's signal sharpened on her instruments 20 minutes later. He could see it now on the navigation display. A familiar human silhouette, a mid-range search and recovery class, the kind Callaway station kept for exactly this category of improbable situation. Someone had come looking. He felt a warmth at that which was genuine and uncomplicated. And he held it without letting it crowd out the other thing, the more complicated warmth. Because both were true, and the world had room for both. Stella helped him to the point in the ship that functioned as an airlock. Again, not a human design, more of a graceful membrane than a door, but performing the same essential service. She had prepared something for him. The translator disc, wrapped in a material he didn't recognize, placed in his hands with a careful deliberateness that echoed the first time she had handed it to him, 3 days and a lifetime ago. He looked at it. Then at her. I can't take this, he said. It's yours. She shook her head, not sharply. The gentle version. The one that meant, the question will keep. Then she said something, and the disc translated it from its own wrapping, a last small act of function. I have another. And you will need it, if you keep meeting people who are not what you expected. He laughed. It came out rougher than he intended. He looked at the disc in his hands, and then at her patient expression and her dark eyes with their caught light and her ears that came to quiet points beneath the fall of her hair and the smile that was already there, the original one, the one he had woken up to. I don't know if I'll find you again, he said. Out here. The space it's very large. The translator worked. She said, It is large, yes, but light travels far. And you are not difficult to find. You had a face. He stood in the membrane of the airlock, and the rescue vessel's docking signal pulsed twice on her instruments, patient and insistent. He committed her to memory with the specific deliberateness of someone who knows they are doing it and does it anyway. The blue of her, the stillness of her, the way she had knelt beside him when he first woke and smiled as if she had been waiting for something and had decided he would do. Thank you, Stella, he said. It was inadequate. He said it anyway. She raised her hand, not a copy of any human gesture but her own version of the same impulse, and held it there. He stepped through. The rescue crew asked him many questions. He answered the practical ones fully and the personal ones partially, and the question of how he had survived with a version of the truth that satisfied their instruments without touching the parts that were not theirs to hold. They gave him a thermal blanket and something hot to drink that was, improbably and almost movingly, coffee. He held the mug with both hands and looked out the small, scratched porthole of the rescue vessel as they pulled away and watched Stella's ship, organic and luminous and utterly unlike anything in the registry, hold still for a moment in the dark. Then it moved, smoothly, without urgency, turning toward the outer edges of the mapped region, toward the unnamed light and the open questions and the full silence she had chosen for herself. Getting smaller. He watched until it was gone. Then he drank his coffee. It tasted like the ordinary world, returning. It tasted, unexpectedly, like something worth returning to. The cold mugs and the losing card hands, and Gerald the succulent, and the long, dull crossings between one place and another that were, when you looked at them in proper proportion, threaded through with everything that mattered. He kept the translator disc in his jacket pocket. He kept it there for a long time after, through the debriefing and the medical checks and the slow bureaucratic resurrection of being officially alive again. Sometimes he took it out and held it. It never translated anything, without her voice to carry to it. But he found he didn't mind. Some things he had learned don't need translation. Some things make the distance between two people feel, if not smaller, then at least honest about its size, which is a different thing from small, but is, in its own way, enough. Outside, the stars burned on, indifferent and permanent and, possibly, if stars are capable of such things, quietly pleased with themselves. The end. We've reached the end of Stella and Daniel's story. Please don't forget to like our story, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for more stories. See you in the next episode, friends.